All right. Are you ready to get into some high-stakes negotiations?
Always ready for that.
Today, we're diving deep into negotiations, like a CEO.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's by Jotham Stein.
I know that name. He's a lawyer, right? Silicon Valley, I think.
You got it. And he's seen it all when it comes to employment
I
agreements.
bet.
Yeah, and he's packed this book with advice, some serious insider tips.
Well, I'm all ears. What's the big takeaway?
You know what I found fascinating?
Yeah.
He doesn't sugarcoat anything.
Like what?
He just comes right out and says anyone can get fired.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's true, right?
Totally. But he says it doesn't matter if you're the founder, the CEO, or a top performer.
Ah, so no one's safe.
People get let go for all sorts of reasons.
Oh, I know that. Some make sense, some, well,
Some are just irrational.
right. And that's got to be tough, especially if you think you're doing everything right.
Totally. And that's where this book's theme really comes in.
What is it?
Understanding and protecting yourself.
Okay, yeah.
Because it can get messy.
So how do you do that? What's his advice?
Well, he has this great analogy. He says, you need to think of your employment agreement like wait for it, like a professional prenuptial agreement.
Okay, that's a good one.
I know, right? I love that.
It makes you think, like things can go wrong,
Exactly.
even when you think they won't.
Right. And he uses this story. It's about Johnny Lou.
Who's that?
So Johnny was a founder,
Okay.
but get this, he was forced out of his own company.
Whoa. Even though it was successful.
Yep, even though it was a success.
It's wild.
And the point is, it wasn't about Johnny's performance.
Gotcha. So it was about.
Shifting board dynamics,
Mhm.
investor influence, all that behind-the-scenes stuff.
So even if you're hitting all your targets, you're not necessarily safe? It's
Exactly.
kind of scary when you think about it.
And this leads into what Stein calls economically irrational behavior.
Okay. What's that?
He basically says, people don't always make logical decisions.
Well, yeah, that's human nature, isn't it? Emotions get involved.
Exactly, and then you throw in personal agendas.
Yeah, forget about logic.
Right. And to illustrate this, he tells this story about Linda.
Okay.
Linda was a COO,
COO. Okay.
and she was promised the CEO position like it was a done deal.
Wow. And then what happened?
She got pushed out.
No way.
Yep. And the worst part is she lost a ton of unvested equity
Ouch. That's gotta hurt.
because her agreement wasn't strong enough.
So that's a big lesson right there.
Totally.
You gotta protect yourself.
You really do.
So what are some things people should be looking out for, especially when they're evaluating a job offer?
Well, I think one of the big things is understanding the players. Like who's involved, what are their motivations.
Makes sense. You gotta know who you're dealing with.
Exactly. And Stein breaks it all down like entrepreneurs, executives, investors, board members, even headhunters and lawyers.
Yeah, they all have their own angles.
Totally. And to show how this all plays out in the real world, he uses this example of Deluge, I think his name was.
Deluge. Okay, what did he do?
He was a CEO, seasoned guy.
All right.
And then there was John, who was a VC looking to fill a CEO spot at one of his portfolio companies.
Ah, so classic startup scenario.
Yep. And he uses it to show how these negotiations, it's like a dance.
Interesting. A dance. Okay.
Each side's trying to figure out their leverage
Right, yeah.
and get the best deal possible.
Makes sense.
But here's another thing Stein emphasizes, understanding the documents.
Yeah, the contracts.
He really stresses that, like, read every clause in your offer letter.
Don't just skim it, you mean?
Right, don't just skim it. You got to understand what it all means.
Yeah, it's easy to gloss over the details.
Totally. And he actually compares a weak offer letter. This one was only 2 pages long.
2 pages? That doesn't seem like much.
Yeah, and he compares it to a much longer agreement. This one was 12 pages.
Okay, big difference. So what was the difference?
The longer one offered way more protection for the employee.
Ah, okay, I see. So it's not just about the length, but what's actually in it.
Exactly. And this one had things like, definitions for cause and good reason when it comes to termination.
Yeah, those are important. They determine whether they can fire you or not.
Right. And it had stuff about accelerated vesting of equity.
Oh, in case you get fired without cause or if the company gets sold.
Right. Or if there's a change in control. And those clauses, they can make a huge difference financially,
Oh, yeah.
especially if things go wrong.
Right. You got to be prepared for that.
Okay, so we've talked about knowing the players, having strong contracts, but what about equity?
Oh, that's a big one, especially these days.
It seems like every startup's offering it.
Yeah.
But Stein has some interesting thoughts on this. He says you can't just blindly accept an equity offer.
It's more complicated than just getting a percentage of the company, right?
Exactly. You got to understand what kind of equity you're getting, what the vesting schedule is.
Right. And the fine print.
And he actually uses this anecdote. It's called not good enough.
Not good enough.
Yeah, and it shows how liquidation preferences can really screw employees over.
What do you mean? How does that work?
Like, imagine the company gets sold for millions,
Okay.
but because of these preferences, the employees end up with nothing.
Wait, how's that possible? You own part of the company.
Well, you see, some investors, especially the early ones, might have this thing called a liquidation preference,
Okay.
and that guarantees them a certain multiple of their investment back before anyone else gets paid.
Oh, I see. So if the sale price isn't high enough.
The common stockholders, who are often the employees, could end up with zero.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is.
So the lesson is don't just focus on the percentage.
Right.
You really need to look into those details.
Totally.
Ask questions, get it all explained clearly,
Exactly.
and make sure you understand the risks.
Absolute.
It's your future we're talking about.
Exactly.
All right, so we've covered a lot. We talked about players, contracts, and even the tricky world of equity.
Yeah, and this is just scratching the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more in this book.
Stein really gets into the nitty-gritty of negotiations.
Well, I'm ready for more. What else does he have to say?
So you were saying Stein gets into the nitty-gritty of negotiation, like how to actually do it.
Exactly. He gives you the tactics.
That's what I love about this book. It's not just theory, it's practical advice.
And he emphasizes knowing your leverage, like what you bring to the table.
Yeah, and not being afraid to walk away.
That's a tough one.
It is, but he says sometimes it's the best move.
Yeah, if the deal's bad, you gotta walk.
And he talks about face-to-face negotiations.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
Well, I guess it's more personal, right?
He says it allows you to really understand the other side's position.
Yeah, it's harder to say no to someone in person.
And it helps build rapport, you know?
Makes sense.
Okay, so we've covered negotiating the initial agreement.
Right, the offer letter, all that.
But then what? Like, things change, right?
All the time.
Companies get acquired, leadership shifts.
Yep, things get messy.
So how do you protect yourself in those situations?
That's where this whole idea of the inevitable change in control comes in.
Ah, yeah, he talks about that.
It's a whole chapter. He's talking about mergers, acquisitions, IPOs.
Yeah, and he uses that story about, what was that company called?
Oh, Hoogtepunt. That high-end brand, right?
Yeah, Hoogtepunt. What happened to them?
They got acquired, and the execs had these earn-out agreements.
Burnout agreements. Remind me what those are again?
So basically, they get paid extra based on future performance.
Oh, right. Okay.
But the acquirer kind of neglected the brand,
Oh, no.
and the executives, they lost out on a lot of money.
So earnouts can be risky.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
They sound great on paper.
Right, but then reality hits.
So what should people watch out for?
Well, Stein says be careful of earnouts that depend on things you can't control.
Right. Makes sense. Like, you can't control everything.
And also negotiate protections if the company gets sold or merges.
Like, what kind of protections?
Well, things like accelerated vesting of your equity.
Okay, yeah.
And clear definitions of good reason for leaving.
So you can walk away without getting penalized.
Exactly.
And he talks about indemnification agreements, too.
Right. Those protect you from lawsuits.
Yeah. Especially important for executives, right?
They're more exposed.
Yeah. And he talks about the employment agreement cram down.
Oh, yeah, that one's tricky.
That's where the new owner tries to force you to sign a worse agreement.
As part of the deal, yeah.
So much pressure. What does Stein say about that?
He says know your worth, be ready to push back,
Don't just cave,
and don't be afraid to walk away.
even if it's a big deal.
If the terms are bad, yeah.
Makes you think.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of it all.
Yeah, but you got to protect yourself.
And he brings up this thing called parachute payment tax.
Oh, yeah, that one caught my eye.
Ever heard of it before?
Never. I had no clue.
It can really blindside you.
Like how?
So if you get a big payout when the company changes hands,
Okay.
you can get hit with a massive tax bill.
He had that example where the exec got like a $20 million tax bill.
Yeah, ouch. Crazy. So it's not just about the money you get.
It's about what you keep.
You got to think about the tax implications.
It's so complicated.
Yeah, well, that's why you got to have good advisors.
So we've covered a lot. Agreements, equity, taxes. Man,
It's a lot to take in.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners? Like, what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the big one is knowledge is power.
He says that a lot.
The more you know, the better you can negotiate.
And protect yourself.
And be proactive. Don't wait for things to happen.
Anticipate the problem.
Be prepared to deal with them.
He talks about not being afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, and seek advice from experts.
Yeah, don't be afraid to push back either.
Right, you got to advocate for yourself.
He frames it as not just about getting the best deal for yourself.
It's about being fair, creating a win-win situation.
Yeah, an agreement that benefits everyone.
That's how you build a sustainable relationship.
And that ties back to this whole idea of negotiate like a CEO.
Right, it's about being strategic,
Informed, not just aggressive.
being in control of your career.
And that's something we can all aspire to, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered agreements, change of control. We talked about legal stuff.
Yeah, a whole whirlwind of info.
What else did we miss? Anything else you think is important to highlight?
Well, I think the last part of the book really brings it all together.
What's that?
It's about the legal landscape and the human side of business, the relationships.
Oh, right. He talks about how things can get messy.
It's not all about contracts and clauses.
Yeah, and he talks about non-compete agreements.
Those are tricky.
I think a lot of people don't really understand them,
Yeah, they can really limit your options.
And he gets into how they work, the legal stuff.
They're different in every state, right?
He says some states are really employer-friendly,
Oh, yeah.
but others, like California, they're basically illegal.
But companies still try to get around it?
He talks about that, yeah.
Like how?
Arbitration agreements, remember?
Yeah, those can be tricky.
He uses that as an example of how they bypass state laws.
So it's important to have a good lawyer.
Someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, who can spot those loopholes.
And he says it's not just about the letter of the law, it's the spirit of it, too.
Okay, what do you mean?
Like, some companies use non-competes unfairly.
To stifle competition.
Exactly, even if it's technically legal.
I see.
And he has this example. It's a real legal letter.
Oh, wow, what is it?
This company accuses a former exec of stealing trade secrets.
Just because he went to work for a competitor.
Crazy, right?
So you got to be ready to defend yourself.
Stein stresses being proactive. Like, review any agreement carefully.
Before you sign it, yeah.
And negotiate for better terms if you can.
He even gives sample language.
I know, right? Super helpful.
Like a cheat sheet.
And if you're ever in a situation where a non-compete is being enforced, he says, get a lawyer.
Immediately.
Because those laws are complex.
And they vary so much.
Okay, so we've talked about agreements, legal stuff, but what about the human side of all this?
Yeah, good point. Business is all about relationships, isn't it?
And Stein talks about that too. He calls it the reincarnation of relationships.
Interesting.
He says the business world is a small place.
You run into the same people.
Over and over again, yeah.
I've definitely seen that.
He tells this story about Katerina.
Katerina.
She's an executive. She gets fired.
Oh, no.
And one of the board members who fired her later offers her a job.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy.
So you never know what's going to happen.
And that's why you shouldn't burn bridges.
Even when you're angry. And it's also about knowing yourself, he says.
Like your strengths and weaknesses?
He uses the example of Jim Jeep.
What did he do?
He left the corporate world for a startup,
Okay.
but then realized he missed the corporate world.
So he went back.
Yeah, it's okay to change course.
Your career doesn't have to be a straight line.
Exactly. And sometimes the best opportunities.
They come from unexpected places.
Absolutely.
So be adaptable, be open to new things.
That's great advice.
And I think, like he says, knowledge is power.
The more you know about how things work,
The better you can navigate this crazy world.
and achieve your goals.
So there you have it, folks. Negotiate like a CEO.
It's a roadmap for success.
It's all about being prepared, knowing your worth, understanding your rights,
And building strong relationships.
and don't be afraid to negotiate. Go out there and negotiate like a CEO.